Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cage View Sports. If you like in-depth breakdowns and analysis on combat sports, you came to the right place. This weekend is UFC 303. I know we lost the Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler fight and countless others, but all things considered, I think it's going to be a solid night of fights on Saturday. For this video, I'm going to be giving my strengths and weaknesses for each fighter and kind of how I think each fighter can win. So without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off with Vinicius Oliveira versus Ricky Simón. I believe with Vinicius Oliveira, what he needs to do is really use his size of frame in this fight, really push Ricky Simón back and make him have to fight on the back foot. In Ricky Simón's fights against Song Yadong and against Mario Bautista, this did prove very troublesome for Ricky Simón, as he is someone who really does like to move forward, and in pressuring him backwards, he can't be the bully. And also, when he does go for those takedowns, it really does bait out those takedown attempts and make it much easier to defend takedowns. Also, I think Vinicius Oliveira needs to look for teeps to the body and look for leg kicks. Moving on to Ricky Simón. In this fight, I do believe Ricky Simón needs to kind of pressure Vinicius Oliveira, really use that wrestling, cardio, and strength. Vinicius Oliveira does have a tendency to throw looping shots and really throw very wild. And in doing so, at times he does throw himself off balance, and those would be perfect openings for Ricky Simón to go for takedowns. Also, Vinicius Oliveira will throw a lot of leg kicks without setups, and he does throw them, commit to them very heavily. He will throw them and actually spin himself around. And in those times where he does spin around, I think there'll also be openings for the takedown. And moving on to other things with Vinicius Oliveira in his boxing defense, he does keep his lead hand low, and he's like to block with his rear hand. And with that rear hand being low, given that both him and Ricky Simón are orthodox, I do believe the overhand and the straight will be there for Ricky Simón. Vinicius was caught by overhands and straights, and also even left hooks in some of his fights in Brave. Against Ali Talib, he was dropped and finished with a left hook. And in Ricky Simón's last fight, he was able to drop Mario Bautista in the first round with the left hook. So I think that would be a great opening for Ricky Simón to exploit. Moving on to the next fight of Japanese prospect Ray Tsuruya versus Carlos Hernandez. Starting off for this fight, Ray Tsuruya is a very gifted grappler, and I believe he needs to use a lot of that grappling and really pressure Carlos Hernandez back. In some of Carlos Hernandez's most recent fights against Tatsuro Taira and also against Alan Nascimento, he did show that he is a little easy. It's easy to pressure him to the cage, and if you do get him down, he will give up his back. And Tsuruya is extremely good on the back, getting the body triangle and looking for a lot of creative submissions. And in Carlos Hernandez's last fight, he was submitted by rear naked choke by Alan Nascimento. And I believe that would be a very great game plan for Tsuruya going into this fight. On the other hand, for Carlos Hernandez, I believe he really needs to use his boxing and his footwork to stay in the center and really pot shot the shoulder man in Tsuruya. Because if he does end up anywhere on the cage, I do believe that will spell the end for Carlos Hernandez. Moving on to Andrei Arlovski versus Martin Buday. In this fight, I believe Andrei Arlovski needs to push Martin Buday back. Buday did really struggle on the back foot against Shamil Gaziev in his last fight, and not allow Buday to bully him, as that is what he normally looks for in his fights. And also with Andrei Arlovski. I do think that as he has gotten older, he has really added a lot of new things to his repertoire, and I think that he can use all of that against Buday in this fight. Moving on to Buday. Buday needs to do what Buday normally does, which is push Andrei Arlovski back to the cage, really work in the clinch, a lot of knees, elbows, and off of the clinch breaks, look for hooks. Buday did show really good 1-2 when trying to come into range, and that could be very good. As with Andrei Arlovski, as he has gotten older, we have seen him in fights where they will be close, but then he'll get caught, and that'll be the end of the fight. He has been fighting for a long time. He is among one of the oldest fighters to compete in the UFC, making his debut in 1999. And he does still display flashes of that former greatness, but he can't sustain it for a whole fight. And I believe that in Buday pressuring him so heavily and constantly being on the attack, it will kind of make Andrei Arlovski falter maybe sooner than he would in any other scenario. Moving on to Michelle Waterson-Gomez versus Gillian Robertson. I believe with Gillian Robertson, she needs to really try to exert her size, height, and weight advantage in this fight. Michelle Waterson was an atomweight that has moved up to strawweight. Atomweight is 103 pounds. Strawweight is 115. The UFC does not have a straw or a atomweight division. And we have seen in Michelle Waterson's fights that when she does go up against bigger opposition, she can be pressured and kind of outstrengthed and outpowered in certain scenarios. And I think that's what Gillian Robertson should look to do here. Really just get her against the cage and just try to just wear on her, try to drag her to the ground. But that may not be that easy, as Michelle Waterson has shown great takedown defense in the past. And this segues into what I believe Waterson should do. Is Waterson should stay on her bike, use a lot of her kicks, and use a lot of her side kicks to the body, and also use some of that takedown defense. She was able to stop 9 of 10 takedowns against Carla Esparza, and Carla Esparza is one of the better wrestlers in this division. And also, I think that Michelle Waterson, one thing that she does that I feel like she can't really afford to do in this fight is when fighters get in past her kicks, she does like to shell up and not throw boxing counters. And I do believe she needs to counter Gillian Robertson and really make her strike as on the feet. Robertson has shown that she isn't always entirely comfortable throwing combinations. She kind of will throw one punch, maybe a jab, a straight, a hook, but they won't be fluid in combination. And I think a lot of those side kicks and the blitzes from Michelle Waterson can really bait out some of that uncomfortability of Gillian Robertson in this one. Moving on to Payton Talbott versus Yanis Ghemmouri. In this fight, I believe Payton Talbott needs to look to counter. What Ghemmouri likes to do is he'll reach out with both hands and try to grab the hands of his opponent. And that works against shorter opposition. Ghemmouri is 5'9" to Payton Talbott's 5'10". And I believe for Payton Talbott, similar to what happened to Daniel Cormier against Stipe Miocic, when Ghemmouri does reach out those hands, I think he needs to counter with hooks to the body and knees. And he can really exploit that with his punching power and shot selection and just ability to find combinations. That can really be a strength for Payton Talbott in this one. Also, I think Payton Talbott needs to push Ghemmouri back. Ghemmouri is a guy who really likes to keep range with those side kicks and leg kicks, and in pressuring him backwards, that will take them away. But on the flip side for Ghemmouri, I believe he really needs to use that side kick to keep Payton Talbott away. He needs to circle, stay on his bike, maybe even try to pressure Talbott back a little bit to kind of take away the forward pressure of Talbott, which he is so good at finding combinations from, and just kind of just keep that range, because if Talbott is able to get in close, able to keep you on the end of his shots and get comfortable, he's very hard to deal with. Moving on to Charles Jourdain versus Gene Silva. I think in this one, Charles Jourdain needs to look for leg kicks, teeps, and jabs and straights. Going up against Gene Silva does have a wide stance, which does leave him susceptible to leg kicks. And also, given how Gene Silva uses his guard, he does keep a high guard, but it is open in the middle. It is very good at blocking hooks from the way he holds his hands, but he is very susceptible down the middle. And given that in this fight, Charles Jourdain is the taller man, I believe the jab straight will be a perfect tool in this one, and also the teeps, given how once he starts to land the jab and the straight, you will see Gene Silva start to kind of close that guard to block those strikes, and then that will leave him open for teeps to the body. Also, I think that, and also moving on, I just think he kind of needs to stay on the outside and pot shot. But moving on to Gene Silva, I believe Gene Silva needs to push Charles Jourdain back to the cage and really use a lot of his looping hooks around the guard to cut off the exits of Charles Jourdain, not allowing him to really circle out and then get back in the center or push him backwards to where he'll have more room to work. And also, I think Gene Silva should use some of his jiu-jitsu and grappling acclimate in this fight, as Charles Jourdain has really struggled with wrestlers in the past, and he has shown inconsistent performances in his UFC career, and that also can pertain to his takedown defense. And I think in doing those, pushing those kind of scenarios, it only benefits Gene Silva. But that'll be a absolute banger. Moving on to Cub Swanson versus Andrei Fili. I believe for Cub Swanson, what he needs to do in this fight is when Andrei Fili fights, he pops out his jab, but he doesn't always retract it in time to be able to block incoming strikes and counters. And I believe that's something that Cub Swanson can exploit here. Andrei Fili in his fights against both Dan Ige and Barriault did show a weakness when against the straights and overhands, as he doesn't get his hand back in time, and fighters are able to get over that or punch straight through it and are able to get the KO on him. And with Cub Swanson, even though he has aged a little, he still shows to be very athletic. He still has a well-rounded game. And I believe that he can really time some of those explosive movements to really time a perfect overhand, which he has shown to have in his career in past performances against both Charles Oliveira and Ross Pearson. I know those fights were a long time ago, but I think that's something Cub Swanson could do here. Also, with Andrei Fili does, when he throws strikes, he will switch and throw strikes from that as well. And when doing so, he will stand square in front of his opponent, leaving himself open for counters and takedowns. And I believe that's something Cub Swanson could also exploit in this fight as well. Moving on to what Andrei Fili could do, I believe Andrei Fili needs to work off his jab, use his boxing combinations, and really mix in takedowns. I think that would work very well here. It's something that he truly excels at. Also, against Cub Swanson, I think he needs to look for leg kicks, as Cub Swanson has been TKO'd recently by Jonathan Martinez by leg kick. And also look for front kicks and body kicks, as Cub Swanson has struggled with those as well in recent fights. And in doing so, I believe that Andre Fili can kind of potshot his way, maybe do a decision. Going on to Joe Pyfer versus Marc-Andre Barriault. I believe the best avenue for victory for Joe Pyfer is to wrestle in this fight. Marc-Andre Barriault has struggled with wrestlers in the past. And also, in mixing in the wrestling, Joe Pyfer can then start to feint off of that, and that will set up overhands and also straights and uppercuts. And Joe Pyfer does have some ridiculous speed and power in his punches, and that can prove to be a very big advantage in this one, as I do believe he has the speed advantage. And in doing so, I think he could get a knockout, or he possibly even could take Barriault down and find a submission. But moving on to Andre Barriault, I believe Andre Barriault has to make this fight kind of dirty. He has to pressure Joe Pyfer and really fight him in the clinch. Marc-Andre Barriault has great knees, great elbows. On the outside, look for body kicks. He does have a nice rear body kick into straight right hand, which he did drop Eric Anders with in their fight in the first round. And I think by also just clinching and leaning on Joe Pyfer, it could sap a lot of Joe Pyfer's cardio. We did see in Joe Pyfer's last fight against Jack Hermanson, he did slow down. And once he did slow down, a lot of his striking defense did kind of lessen as well. And in doing that, Andre Barriault can really start to maybe, once he wears on Joe Pyfer, slows down Joe Pyfer's explosiveness, he can really start finding his range on the feet. But that's going to be a very interesting fight. Moving on to the first fight of the main card and one of the closest fights on the card, Ian Garry versus Michael Venom Page. I think in this fight, Michael Page to win needs to just kind of fight how Michael Page does. Stay on the outside, really use that lead shoulder to mask a lot of his attacks as he explodes into that right hand. Ian Garry, this is the first time he's going to be facing someone who is 6'3" and can match him in height and actually has a longer reach than him at 79 to Garry's 74. And we've seen in the past with Ian Garry's striking defense, he does leave his lead hand out and uses that really to gauge. And that does work very well against shorter opposition, but against a taller fighter in Michael Page, who is so explosive, and leaving that hand out, it could leave an opening over the top for the devastating straight of Michael Page. Also, Michael Page does do a very good job of, when he throws strikes, he does lean back, switch into the opposite stance, and circle out. And I believe he needs to do that in this fight, is to really use that movement to keep the center and really just open up more opportunities for that explosive right hand. Moving on to what Ian Garry needs to do. Ian Garry, I think, needs to really mix in his overall MMA repertoire in this fight. We do know that Ian Garry is a judo black belt, and he does train with a lot of high-level wrestlers at Kill Cliff MMA. And I think this would be the perfect fight to show that. Michael Venom Page has struggled against wrestlers in the past. He has shown that his style with his explosiveness and a lot of his pull counters and stance switching does lend himself to not having the best takedown defense, as when he pulls, he does expose his hips, leaving him open for takedowns. And I think that would be something great for Ian Garry to exploit in this fight. And maybe once he starts getting takedowns and making Michael Page hesitate and really worry about the threat of the takedown, it will open up the striking for Garry. But I believe that's what he needs to do in this fight. Moving on to Mayra Bueno Silva versus Macy Chiasson. I believe in this fight, Macy Chiasson needs to really pressure Bueno Silva and really start to attack the body, look to clinch her, look to really wear on her. It seemed like in that Raquel Pennington fight, Raquel Pennington was able to do that to Bueno Silva, and it really did do a number on Bueno Silva's cardio as she did slow down halfway in the latter half of the second and the early third. And Macy Chiasson does have great cardio, and she could probably use a similar game plan. But also that kind of feeds into the way I also think that Bueno Silva could win this fight is that Bueno Silva, I believe, has the Muay Thai and striking advantage in this fight. We've seen Chiasson, even though she is the taller of the two, she does kind of not feel comfortable throwing combinations on the feet. And with Bueno Silva, she can pressure Chiasson and really start winning those striking exchanges. It could make Chiasson panic to where she does shoot an ill-advised single or double. And with the way Chiasson chases takedowns, she does shoot them and stay on her knees rather exploding to her feet to drag her opponent to the ground and really get drive into the takedown. And that could be beneficial for Bueno Silva as if she pressures Chiasson, really makes her have to shoot a single before she is fully comfortable doing so. She may not explode up, and then Bueno Silva can get a guillotine, get the back, get the ninja choke, and that's how I think that Bueno Silva could win this fight. Okay, moving on to Roman Dolidze versus Anthony Smith. I believe in this fight, Anthony Smith has to really utilize his jabs, leg kicks, and front kicks to the body. We did see Roman Dolidze struggle with these in his fight against Imavov, as Roman Dolidze likes to throw a lot of looping shots with a ton of power, but if they don't land, they really fatigue him. And in throwing the jab, straight shots always beat looping shots. And Anthony Smith actually does have a very good and underrated jab, and also a very good and underrated double jab. And he can use both of those in this fight to really frustrate Roman Dolidze, who is coming in on short notice. We don't know he is coming up a weight class. We don't know where his cardio is at for this fight. And in just putting all those things out there, it's going to just little by little take away from the overall cardio of Roman Dolidze. And on the flip side, for Roman Dolidze, I do believe he needs to go out, look for some leg kicks in this fight, but mostly look to clinch Anthony Smith up against the cage, as he will at times back up willingly, and I'll pressure him back to the cage, tie him up, and try to drag him to the ground, as Anthony Smith will look for submissions off his back and won't be always very urgent to get back to his feet. And I think that's where Roman Dolidze can really take advantage, get him down where he has the grappling advantage, hold him there, and really look to frustrate Anthony Smith into maybe giving him something to find a submission, or just win off of points and just keep scoring and just racking up points as Anthony Smith just tries to defend off his back and maybe find a submission that doesn't come. And moving on to one of the big ones, Brian Ortega versus Diego Lopes. I think this fight is really going to come down to if Diego Lopes can finish Brian Ortega early, or Brian Ortega is going to survive. So looking at Diego Lopes is a very aggressive finisher. He has a great ground game. Probably is one of the best in the featherweight division, but what makes this fight so good is Brian Ortega is probably one of the few fighters that can actually rival Diego Lopes on the ground. And with that, I think Diego Lopes really needs to pressure Brian Ortega, really flurry him early, and try to catch him, as Brian Ortega has shown in past fights that he is a little bit of a slow starter. And He in his last fight against Yair Rodriguez, he was dropped multiple times before Brian Ortega was eventually able to gather his wits about him and really get going and get a submission later in the fight. But those are all things that Diego Lopes could use here. On the flip side, with Brian Ortega did show improved takedown ability in his last fight against Yair. I do believe that would be good to use in this fight, as if he does shoot takedowns, I believe Diego Lopes does prioritize submissions over position, and he will drop guillotine. He will look for submission offense. And if Ortega is able to initiate the takedown and then defend the submissions, he could end up on top, where I do believe he is the better of the two fighters positionally. And also, with that being said, I do think that Diego Lopes, 4 out of his 6 losses are by decision. So if he's able to stall this fight out by getting on top and really using his grappling to hold position, he could tire Lopes out and then get a win that way. And we've seen also with Lopes looking for submissions is when he does get to his back, he is more than content staying on his back, trying to find submissions rather than urgently getting back to his feet. And that also could benefit Brian Ortega in this fight as well. And okay, that's all I have for that one. On to the big one, Jiri Prochazka versus Alex Pereira 2. I do believe, with UFC 300 only being mere months ago and this fight being put together on short notice, I don't really see both fighters using game plans completely different than what they did in their first meeting. But with that being said, for Alex Pereira, I think he needs to really start utilizing the calf kicks early and really start getting them going, as with both him and Yuri's performance at UFC 300, Yuri did have the more difficult of the two. He did go through a very vicious first round against Alexander Rakic, where Rakic did land a lot of vicious leg kicks and also just a lot of vicious strikes. And with that being said, if Alex Pereira starts those calf kicks early, they could do a number on Jiri and really sap away some of that explosiveness and speed and really slow down those takedown entries. And also, they work to frustrate Jiri as they did in the first fight, where Jiri may feel like panic and feel like he needs to explode and score. And in doing so, he ends up blitzing right into a left hand or right into a counter. And also, Jiri, like in the first fight, Alex Pereira, like in the first fight, needs to really time when Jiri plants his feet and really uses that setup of hopping up and down and kicking him in the calf right when he plants his feet to really amplify the power on those calf kicks. And I think if Alex Pereira does this, he could see a similar victory to how he got it in the first fight. But moving on to Jiri, I think Jiri needs to do a lot of the same of what he did in the first fight, really mixing in the takedowns. And what I really liked that he did was feinting the takedowns and coming up with uppercuts. I think that would be great to use in this fight as well, but also maybe to also look for overhands over the top, as Alex Pereira did struggle in his fight against Bruno Silva when Bruno Silva didn't mix in a lot of grappling. It threw off the boxing counters of Alex Pereira and did make him drop his hands. And I think that would leave the opening for Jiri over the top. And also, in doing so, he can also get Pereira to the ground, where I believe he can hunt submissions and really give Alex Pereira a tough time, as Pereira did get up a few times in their first fight, but Jiri was able to score a lot of takedowns. But with all of that being said, what do you guys think of the fights this weekend? How do you think they're going to play out? Who are you guys rooting for? Let me know in the comments below. Like, comment, subscribe, and I really hope to see you guys in the next one.